Welcome to the Recovery.com podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mala, and today we're joined by Dr. Sarah Anderson, a distinguished member of Midwestern University's occupational therapy team since 2018. Dr. Anderson, with a doctorate from A.T. Still University and a vast range of training from sensory processing to emotional intelligence, specializes in everything from maternal wellness to trauma informed care for all ages, and so much more. I'm so excited to talk to you today. Welcome, Dr. Sarah.
Yes, it's so nice to be here, Dr. Mala. Thank you for having me on.
Of course. So, I want to talk about your journey and I want to talk about occupational therapy because not many people know what occupational therapy is and how it can be relevant to their care. So, tell me a little bit more. How did you get into this field? What is this field about? Let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah. So I actually went to my undergrad. I thought I was going to be a physical therapist. And there were some prereqs for PT that weren't my favorite, like physics and
Mhm.
chem. I'm definitely more of a people person. And so I think when I was taking those classes, I wasn't really sure if PT was the route for me. And in that same time frame, I had an uncle who fell from a deer stand while hunting and he had a spinal cord injury, a cervical spinal cord injury, and then a
Mhm.
TBI. And so with that, he had a lot of service providers, and one of them was an occupational therapist. And what I loved about the OT is that she was much more focused on both the physical but also the mental health piece. It seemed like her role was a little bit different than the vast majority of people. And then probably a couple weeks after that, I was in intro to kinesiology course where they had all of these professionals come in and talk about all the things that you could do with a kinesiology degree. And it was an OT. And in my mind, I thought, oh, I thought this was what PT
Mhm.
was. And so that's kind of how I found OT. I loved how there was this blend between both mental health, but also potential physical rehabilitation. And so, occupational therapy is usually a field that most people don't know about until you either receive OT or a loved one needs OT. But one of the best parts about our field is that we are really diverse, but it's also probably one of the hardest parts about being in the field because it's hard to advocate for what we do in the different arenas that we're in. And so when I went to school, I thought I was going to specialize in neuro rehabilitation and work with individuals who had spinal cord injuries. And the courses that I loved the most when I was in school was mental health. But the hard part about mental health OT is that there are a lot fewer opportunities for us due to a variety of reasons, one of which can be insurance. And if we're distinguished as a mental health provider in the state that we're in, no matter what state you're in, you can be in mental health as an occupational therapist. It's just a matter of what does the reimbursement look like? And I know anyone in healthcare, everybody deals with the challenges with insurance reimbursement, but that's usually the trickiest part. And so I just felt like maybe there wouldn't be as many opportunities. So I did a different route right out of school. I worked in pediatrics. So I did pediatric home health. I worked at a clinic and then I worked at a school for the deaf. And those were my first 2, 3 years of practice. And while I was working at the school for the deaf, I started to notice like a lot of different kinds of behaviors. And most of the kids that went there, about 5% of the families learned how to sign. And the rest, it wasn't necessarily that they just didn't want to, it was like access to resources and time. And there's a lot of social determinants of health that played a huge part, I think, in the ability to do that. But a lot of these students also had a lot of
Mhm.
trauma, like complex childhood trauma. And I found myself diving into that and being so interested in how to be able to meet their needs and nervous system regulation and all of those things. And so around that time, I went back and got my doctorate. And then I started teaching at Midwestern. And then I left the school for the deaf and then started to work at a place called Child Help, which is an advocacy center for children who've experienced
Mhm.
abuse. And from there, I've been in mental health now for 7, 8 years. And it's definitely my love. And there's such a place for OT. And I think within the field, in terms of mental health, it's just harder to figure out what's the role, where's the reimbursement coming from, and who are the populations that you're serving through
I love
OT.
it. I love it. Yeah, I always say, especially when I was practicing in treatment centers, like occupational therapists are so beneficial for combined treatment and integrative treatment, and people just don't realize it. So I think,
Mhm.
again, for our audience, what would an occupational therapy session look like? What does it entail? What does the assessment look like? What could we expect?
Yeah. Yes. So OTs, we assess a person's ability to engage in their everyday life. So occupational therapy comes from the term occupation. And there are 9 different areas of occupation that we as OTs can address. So ADLs like bathing, grooming, dressing, those basic things. IADLs, which are going to be more like instrumental activities of daily living. So grocery shopping, raising a child and being a parent, those types of things. And then we've got sleep and rest, social participation, health management. So that can be like caring for personal products like hearing aids and like other devices that a person needs to be able to get around and live their life. We have work and education, leisure and play. So play is the main occupation for a child. And leisure is usually an area that we don't emphasize enough, but leisure based engagement is really important for mental health. And so when I'm assessing someone, I'm going to do an occupational profile to determine like where are they at in all of those different areas? Are they independent? Are they needing assistance? And then are there additional barriers that are there that are inhibiting engagement in that particular area of occupation? And then we will also do some standardized assessments depending on like what the
Mhm.
specialty is. And so I've really found, and I'm a true believer that OT has a very different role than other mental health providers, right? We're not processing trauma. And I will say that I do know that there are like some OTs out there who may navigate into that space, but I definitely feel, and having been in academia and really looking through the literature of what is our role as OTs, we are really more looking at what are the skills a person needs, like the performance based skills. How can we adapt and modify the environment or the tasks they need to engage in for meaningful engagement? So, my area of specialty is executive functioning and then sensory
Oh,
processing. And so, I do a sensory profile, which is an evidence, valid and reliable instrument that is standardized that I use with every client to determine what is their unique sensory profile, how are they processing sensory stimuli, and then I'll also do some sort of executive function based assessment. So that's kind of like an overview of what an evaluation might look like, just to determine where are the barriers, what are the skills that we need to
yeah.
develop so that so I can help get people back to living their
I love
life.
it. So, executive function, huge word right now. It's got a
Mhm.
lot of buzz. Can you define it and then also go
Yeah.
into what you're looking at when you're looking at executive? And then I want to
Yeah.
dig into, of course, what everybody wants to know more about, which is how do you get control of it?
So, executive function is really the ability to have the skills to have goal oriented behavior, which really is like this broad way to define it because there's so much more that goes into it. But it's everything from organization, planning, prioritizing, task initiation, which directly relates to procrastination. So, pretty much everybody I work with struggles immensely with
Mm,
procrastinating. And then that leads into self regulation. And emotion regulation is a piece of it. And there's metacognition as well. But it's really the skills that we need cognitively to be able to do tasks, organize our environment, plan. I even think about when I'm working with someone and they're having difficulty living on their own and even like eating. Are you eating 3 meals a day? Well, I mean, sometimes, but not really. Like, where's the barrier? And usually, with someone with executive functions, I have to go to the grocery store, but that takes time. And then I buy groceries, but then none of my ingredients for the meal I want did I buy. And there's all this planning and organizing issues going on. So it's a lot of systems that I build with clients, like, and everybody requires a different system because everybody functions differently. And then also skill building. And so while I do the same thing with pretty much almost every client I work with, it looks very
mhm,
different depending on their unique
yeah.
needs. And so I have a contract with an addiction center, and every single client I work with has executive functioning
Mhm.
deficits. And the research is really interesting too, where they estimate about 80% of people with substance use challenges have executive function issues. And so when we think about too recovery and then independent living after recovery, if we don't have the ability to plan and manage our time and organize, it is really hard to have sustainable recovery, especially in addiction recovery, specifically substance use. There's all of these steps you have to take. You have to be going to meetings, you have to be socially active, you have to have a job, you've got to be able to live on your own. And when you get into recovery, it's very structured. You know where you're going to go. There's people to tell you what to do. You've got therapists helping you out. And then you go to sober living or back into the real world. And then it's like, how do I manage all
Mhm.
of this? And if you don't have someone there helping you build the skills or the systems for your everyday life, it's really hard to have sustainable recovery.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm gonna put an asterisk by it, like, without necessarily having a diagnosed recovery plan, the
Mhm.
majority of the world can raise their hand to wanting that help or structure and the want for structure and discipline that you're describing. I
Yes.
try to shape my day around different things like that, but even still, it can get overwhelming. So, what is your suggestion? What is your advice? How do you navigate coming back into the real world and starting or
Mhm.
implementing these plans?
A planner. Everybody needs a planner of some kind, and finding the system that works best for you is key. So, right, executive function in dysfunction is most closely associated with ADHD, but it can come with a lot of other things: anxiety,
Yeah.
depression, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and even just in general, when people are
Yeah.
stressed, your executive functioning is going to be impacted. So whether it is finding a system that works, so like some people love things on their phone, but if they are easily distracted by all the other apps. So I actually give every client a planner. I have a plethora of planners available. They're all a little bit different because everyone likes something different. So it's being able to figure out, how do you like to visualize your day or the tasks you need to do? The other thing is helping people learn what it means to prioritize. So I love using something called the Eisenhower
Mhm.
matrix, which helps people understand what is a priority and what is not, and what is urgent and what is not. And being able to start to wrap their minds around, how do I actually effectively prioritize tasks so I don't feel bogged down in my
Mhm.
day? In the third big thing I work on too with clients is, even when stuff is feeling really good, there is a chance that things are going to become
Yeah.
chaotic again. But it's the idea that you can find your way back more easily, and you don't have a ton of stress or anxiety or get into that space where you just want to like crawl in a hole and
Mhm.
isolate. And so having these systems in place essentially are like the guide and the environmental cues to make everything easier if there are uncontrollable things in a person's life that make these types of skills harder to implement. Other things too are having your home really organized. I think phones are the greatest thing ever, but they're also the worst and they're so distracting. And so even having a home for your phone, your keys, your wallet, so that you know where they go every day and you commit to developing this habit of putting your keys in a place, your phone in a place, your wallet in a place, so that you're not running around frantically in the morning trying to find your stuff and you're already late
I
for
love
work.
I love that,
And
having a home for your stuff. Yeah, that's really good.
everything needs a
Mhm.
home.
Mhm.
And the other part too is habit stacking. I know routines and habits are also a hot topic. James Clear book, Atomic
Mhm.
Habits, is fabulous. That really started to help people understand, like, what does it mean to have habits. And as OTs, we're masters at
Mhm.
routine and habits because we specialize in something called activity analysis. So when someone's having trouble with a specific task, we look at where the issue's coming from. So what habit stacking essentially means is you have a set routine, and then this new habit that you want, you integrate it into an already established routine, which makes it easier to become automatic. Habits and routines are so needed in life because they decrease the cognitive load or the cognitive capacity at which a person needs to function. You don't have to think about things, you just do them. And if we had to actively think about every single thing that we do throughout the day, we would be so tired and fatigued by the end of the day. And then I also think, though, that speaks to different mental health challenges and why some people at the end of the day are just like, I am overloaded. I can't do this. I'm so tired all the time. And sometimes it's because they're having to think about so much all the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a true thing, like executive function fatigue and how that can impose upon one's ability to even maintain. So you said some great things again there that for me, they're like, yep, check, check, check. I want organization of the house, maintaining that schedule. A lot of that can seem daunting to somebody who's in recovery and just coming out. What do you recommend and how do you work through exactly that? Just that feeling of overwhelm.
Mhm. One step at a
Mm,
time. So it's like there's big goals, this like feeling that we're looking for. I just want to feel like I'm put together. I want things to feel easy. And you will
mhm,
get there, but it's one step at a time. So for most clients I work with, when they're coming out of recovery, say they're in intensive outpatient IOP and they're going to be stepping down and moving into sober living or out of residential or whatever it may be, work is usually
mhm,
number one. And so we work on some of these skills through finding a job, resume building, having a planner, and scheduling time to do these things and prioritizing them. So it's taking the executive functioning skills and applying them to one area of occupation or like one specific goal. And then as they start to master the ability to think in this way, we can then apply to other parts of their life, but we can't do it all at once, or that just adds to the
yeah.
overwhelm and the desire to
Yeah.
procrastinate.
Yeah. Oh, procrastination. So that's a big one, right? So you said desire to procrastinate. Let's talk about that a little bit more, that tug of war. So tell me, what have you seen? What is a common thing? What leads people to wanting to procrastinate, stay in the world of procrastination?
I like to break this down with clients too. There's so many different theories and reasons as to why people procrastinate, but one of the biggest ones is when you have an overwhelming task, right? And it's big, and you're like, I'm going to put it off. Your brain gets this tiny little dopamine hit of, oh, that feels good to put it off. Okay. And then it feeds into the desire to
Mhm.
procrastinate. And so it's an issue with self regulation as well as task initiation to just get going. And so there are a lot of different ways in which we can work with clients to help reduce procrastination and increase task initiation. It also depends on the reason why. And sometimes I work even just on the self reflection piece of where is this coming from? Because unless we can really honor that piece, sometimes one intervention isn't going to be as effective as
Sure.
another. So I do have some clients, right? And this is probably my least favorite diagnosis of all time, but I see it from time to time as like
Oh,
oppositional
yeah.
defiant disorder.
Yep.
And they just don't want to do it, or even pathological demand avoidance syndrome, PDA, which is a newer one that's been applied in Europe, but it isn't quite
Sure.
adopted in the
Yeah.
States. But they just don't want to do things that are asked
Mhm.
of them. And they often are my favorite clients to work with because it's figuring out where is this coming from. And sometimes it's just like the expectations placed on them and understanding how they meet expectations so that they can find more internal motivation to be able to do it. And I have no judgment. I'm a very neuro affirming therapist, meaning I honor
Mhm.
neurodivergence. I'm not picking out their goals. I'm not telling them what they have to do. Yes, sometimes society or parents or whatnot, they have boundaries, and boundaries are great and healthy, but it's figuring out how can we foster this internal motivation within these structured boundaries. It's figuring out what makes them tick. And I feel like a good therapist is going to take the time to recognize that versus if you don't fit into my box, I'm sorry, I
Right.
just can't help you. With that said, though, they do have to have buy in and be motivated. So it's, I think, holding space for struggles and then helping them problem solve where are they coming from. Everybody's different.
With the procrastination, the other thing that comes to my mind is that there's that hit that we get, that positive reinforcement that ends up occurring.
Mhm.
Procrastinate, and then you get into that mode of, I'm gonna do it all at the last minute and then feel
Yes.
amazing that you finished it, right?
Ah,
Then
yeah.
now anxiety
But
levels go up, your stress is all of that gets
yep.
bundled up into a ball. I think there's, especially in the recovery space, I've seen people falling into that camp or people falling into the camp of, I just don't like it and I'm scared of it. There's some kind of fear or anxiety, which is reinforcing that procrastination that leads to avoidance. I'd love to hear your thoughts a little bit more on that.
And I think a lot of it too, as you're talking through that, is that self-regulation piece. When I'm working with a client, I practice from something called the PEO model, person, environment, occupation
Mhm.
model. It's a model used in OT. And so I'm looking at the person and the skills they have and the problems they're experiencing. And then I'm looking at what are the occupations or the occupation they need to engage in. And then I'm looking at the
Mhm.
environment and how can maybe we adapt that. We look at procrastination as a problem or the barrier to
Sure.
engagement. And the skills that need to be developed might be planning, organizing, breaking down big tasks to be able to manage them better. And so those are skills we can work on so that as things build up and become harder, they don't do it at the end, get the dopamine hit, and then they're fine. It's like working through some of these projects and things they do and guiding them of how to break it
Mhm.
down, how to document it in their planner, how to check things off so you still feel like you're getting things done throughout the day. Because sometimes people, if they can't get the big thing done, it doesn't feel like they're
Mhm.
making progress. So helping them with that. The other part is I look at the environment. Are there ways that we can adapt the environment to make it easier to engage in the task, whether it's how we're designing the space, the things we're bringing into our space, whether it's like candles or essential oils or smells that can be motivating, even gum, or like, can we eat something that might increase alertness? And that's a tricky one too, because we don't want food to always be a primary reward, but sometimes it can be really helpful. And then even everything from like the fabric or the type of thing that you're sitting on, is it comfortable? Can you sit there for a while and work? What's your lighting
Mhm.
like? Helping people understand how the environment impacts regulation. And so really turning to those other things. Also, individuals who are big time procrastinators, if there are tasks that they have to do maybe like once a month, before engaging in that task that you want to procrastinate in, get some movement, exercise, be really aware of the things you're doing before so that you're in this space to be able to engage in this thing that might feel a little bit
Mhm.
harder. Kind of re-looking at how you're
Mhm.
functioning in your day-to-day life, in your morning routines and evening routines. But procrastination can't just be addressed from just the perspective of we're going to build these skills and everything's going to be better. There's a lot more that goes into it. It's a really complex
Yeah, for
issue.
sure. For sure. No, this is so good. I'm going to shift a little bit to the trauma informed care that you've also focused on. And this is so important because one of my sayings and our sayings is everyone is recovering from something. And I think now that we're talking about it and that mental health is on the table for discussion, I'm excited to see that people are sharing their stories more, wanting to share their stories more. And so often we see trauma is woven in to a story. I know that trauma informed care is pivotal to your work. Can you talk to me a little
Yeah.
bit about what that looks like for you and what even motivated you to focus on that in your career? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, trauma just impacts people at such a deep, deep level. I'm a really big fan too of, I likely pronounce his first name wrong, but Dr.
Yeah.
Mate,
Yeah, we're not
Gabor
yeah,
Gabor
yeah.
Mate. Yeah, yes. I think I've read every book he's ever written, and it's just so fascinating to his perspective on, are a lot of these mental health diagnoses we've seen a
Yeah.
result of
Mhm.
trauma? And I definitely believe that. And yes, is there a genetic component, but we even look at like epigenetics and all the things.
Mhm.
And so I don't think you can work in mental health in today's day and age and not be trauma informed and trauma responsive. So it's this idea that when you're working with a person, you are holding space for where they're at, you're giving them choice and autonomy in their care, you're collaborating. And it's this idea that you are not intentionally engaging with them in a way that is going to re traumatize them. But I also think in today's day and age, too, trauma is such a big word, right? And even like this misunderstanding between a stress response and a trauma
Yeah.
response. They're
Yeah.
different. And it is okay to be uncomfortable and grow, but there are ways in which we interact with individuals who've experienced trauma that can be damaging. And we want to just make sure that we're doing it in a way that isn't causing more trauma, that it's healing in nature.
Yeah.
And so when I'm working with a client, it's titrating an experience, giving them little amounts versus a big thing that make them able to develop the skills to cope so that they build
Love it. Yeah.
resilience.
I love that. I love that. So for our audience who may not know, and again, facing those traumas often is very daunting, especially through the recovery process. What are the first steps? What do you recommend?
Yeah. So I think if they've experienced trauma and they're looking to get support what
Mhm.
to do, always make sure the therapist is trauma informed, right? If you are someone who has experienced trauma and you're looking for support, likely OT will not be your first step. It may be if there's a lot of like sensory issues and executive functioning going on, but more often than not, you're going to look for a therapist who can help you process. Because of being in mental health, I have a lot of exposure to a lot of different types of trauma based
Mhm.
therapy. And there's everything from
Yep.
EMDR, DBR is a new one I've heard of, SE, somatic experiencing. And so I think it's figuring out too where you're at and what is too
Mhm.
much. And even asking the therapist, how do you describe yourself in your
Mhm.
approach? Tell me what I can expect. And then your ideal client population. I know a lot of individuals where EMDR feels like it's too much. DBR and somatic experiencing have been shown to be quite effective. They haven't been around
Mhm.
as much. And EMDR is so popular because it's like gold standard in research and there's a lot of data to support it, but there are other ways to engage in it. I even think about, though, even in everyday life, finding providers just in general who are trauma informed,
Mhm.
even like medical
Yeah.
providers. You think about how invasive some of those types of exams can
Mhm.
be. Believe it or not, there are a lot of really amazing medical providers who have some trauma informed knowledge of how they engage with clients. So I think it's just being an
Mhm.
advocate and then being curious and asking questions so that you can find the right care for
That's so
yourself.
important. I love that you said that. And for everyone, we're all patients in some way, shape, or form. I can't advocate enough that we should be asking the questions. We should be advocating for ourselves
Yes.
and not fearing asking those questions. So thank you for saying that. And that's
Hmm.
really great. There's so much I want to talk to you about. So, with trauma informed care and advocating and doing all of the things that you've done, I know you focused on a lot of pediatric work. And you mentioned Gabor Mate, and we talk about how early experiences of trauma get embedded into our way of living, our
Mhm.
approach to things, and oftentimes can be the reasons why our executive functioning is what it is. And we have challenges there. Our sensory issues are what they are. How did you start to navigate that? What do you recommend in terms of youth who are feeling this and also maybe
Mm,
showing that they have challenges
yes.
in these areas and how to do that, how to
Yes.
navigate that?
I'm so glad you brought this up. But I feel like if you are a parent or you are someone that knows a child, works with a child, or cares for a child that maybe is having some difficulties, usually they start to pop up in school because there's a lot more pressure with academics and structure and things like that. Getting them support early on. I think that we focus so much on
Mhm.
academic that we forget to focus on life skill
Yeah.
development. And then when I'm working with my young adults, that's where the problem was. I mean, academics, yes, but there was no support for the life skill development. And so you always want to find a provider too who has a strong understanding of development because that's really important. So I'm a mom. I've got a 5-year old and an almost 3-year old. And so I understand what reasonable expectations are for emotion regulation. And my oldest is just this wonderful, lovely, amazing child who has really big emotions. So she's highly sensitive and she's a chit chatter in class and she has a lot of strengths, but we are structured at home with flexibility, but she needs structure and routine in her life. She is sometimes anxiety going to school because she's thinking about all the things and she has all these expectations in her mind of how the day should go. And she's a gem at school. She's so good, aside from the circle time chit chatting, but even her teacher's like, it's totally okay. But when she comes from school, sometimes we feel this emotional letdown of like, I've held it in all day and I just need to be
Yeah.
myself. So we provide her with that space. Working with an OT can be really helpful, whether your child is like that or your child is a sensory seeker and they can't sit down and they're moving all the time, or maybe your child is showing significant signs of anxiety already. You want to work with a provider that's going to play with them to help them build these skill sets. There's a really wonderful program out there and it's copyrighted and everything. So I'm just wanting to honor that. It's a really great program called the Zones of Regulation. And a lot of OT use it to be able to help children categorize emotions to make sense of
Mm,
them. So there's like the blue zone, green zone, yellow zone, red zone. And so, like, anger can fit in the red zone, and the yellow zone's frustration of overwhelm, but sometimes feeling really silly can also be in the yellow
mhm,
zone. And then green zone's more like calm, connected, I can listen. And then the blue zone is like low feeling, more like sick or sad or depressed could even
mhm,
fit in there, and helping them understand what these emotions are. And then with that program, you can then build interoceptive awareness, which is your internal sense. So, interoception plays a role in feeling nauseous or going to the bathroom. Like you have to have that to potty train, but it is key when it comes to detecting
mhm,
emotion. And so, like, we even know through research that individuals who engage in self harm or might have, suicidal ideation have very low
mhm,
interoception. So that can be a really effective way to help them improve resilience. But in kids, interoceptive awareness is key in terms of emotional discrimination. So, what emotion am I feeling? And it's vital for self regulation. If they don't know what they're feeling, they're not going to be able to detect these subtle nuances of an emotion and then find a way to cope. So, 7 is around the age at which a child can start to more independently regulate. 12, typically developmentally, we can expect some really solid, good regulation, but adolescence is also a really tricky area that it's not going to be perfect. So, 5, 4, 3, younger, we can't have this expectation that they're doing it on their own. So, as a parent, even being able to demonstrate regulation, co regulate them, meaning you help them identify what they need and then you do it together. There's a lot of ways to do it, but I definitely think if you're recognizing maybe there's something going on with your child, you also want to do reflection and say as well, are there things that maybe I need to learn as well to be able to support them at home? Because it always starts in the
mhm.
home. And they're not about being perfect. I don't think I ever want to put pressure on parents to
Yeah,
be perfect because I definitely feel that myself, but really being able to internalize these skills so that we can demonstrate them and help our children out
yeah,
with them.
yeah, for sure. I also think about adolescents who end up falling into devices and their recovery that's
Mhm.
necessary, their substance use that they're recovering from, and addiction, and what have you, and how easily, of course, peer pressure, but environment, all the things. There's the executive function getting taxed, there's the emotions getting played upon, and so much. What are your recommendations for parents, and I would even say children, teens alike, to help with
Mhm.
navigating that world?
Yeah. Building structure at home is really important. And if you are a parent listening and you might identify maybe having some neurodivergence, whether it's ADHD or autism or something else, because I see a lot of that. I work with a lot of parents
Yeah.
and then their children as well. Um, get support for the family. You don't have to do it alone. You're not expected to do alone. But then also in the home, having structured routines, having schedules, really building those skills with your child so that they can learn to do it on their own. Monday, we make our bed and pick up our room every day. We then have a chart where you can check it and they can see I completed it. Rewards are
Mhm,
awesome. It doesn't have to be a big reward, but really when it comes to reducing procrastination and building task initiation, having rewards is key. That's just how we function as human beings. When we think about rewards in kids, adolescents, teens, it's like we don't want to have too many rewards, but I want if you're listening and you're an adult, I want you to start to think about what are all the little rewards you give yourself throughout the
mhm.
day. Maybe a Starbucks, maybe a yummy treat, maybe a break outside, but we build them in and we don't even
Got
think
it, yeah.
about it. And so our kids starting to do that healthy in a healthy way, that it's key for motivation. I even think about having structured places where your teen or your adolescent or your child can go to
Mm,
access tools that help them regulate. It's in the same place all the time. They know that it's there. You might have to help in the beginning, but then they can seek it out on their own eventually. but it's building those systems in the home that help children, adolescents, teens be able to develop the skills so that someday when they go off and they're an adult, it becomes
Right,
easier.
right. I love it. And so you mentioned some of those things. There's mindfulness and there's practice
Mhm.
that's involved. So I'm sure you've integrated mindfulness and holistic approaches in your practice. Can
Mhm.
you give us some examples of like your go-tos that you recommend
Yes.
and that are easily integrated into the household?
The best is mindful eating. Because it's easy to do. You pick up your food item. I've got my coffee, so I look at it, think about the color, maybe the textures. I've got some ice in there, and I look at it and take it in. And then maybe I smell it and just kind of pay attention to how it smells. Then maybe I touch it to my lips. And how does it feel on my lips? Is it cool? Is it warm? And then do it with your tongue, and then as you're swallowing it. And you just take a moment to just be in the moment with what you are
Mm,
consuming. And you can do it as a family. And whether it's maybe the first bite before you eat, or maybe if you're a family that sometimes does dessert, you could do it at the end. It also builds regulation and builds impulse control. And when I work with children doing it, usually I have to have a bunch of whatever the food is because it's not going to happen the first couple of
mhm,
times. But over time, they get used to just taking that break before they engage in the eating and really thinking about it as they're doing it. And the impulse control piece and mindfulness, it's so important. And I think when we think about mindfulness practice as this big thing, it's way too
mm,
overwhelming for people. They're just not
yeah.
going to it. So finding an easy way to integrate it into your life is key. Even at the top of the hour, a couple times a day, you can sit and pay attention to your breath. You can do some progressive muscle relaxation where you're tightening and then letting go of different parts of your body and paying attention to the
Mhm,
tension and then what the release feels like. Another favorite of mine, and I think it's because it incorporates that sensory piece, is taking a walk outside and thinking about five things that you see, four things that you hear, two
oh,
things that you
yeah.
smell, maybe the way your body feels when it's moving, but just really paying attention to the sensory
Mhm,
aspect.
mhm. I love it. So with all of this, where do you hope to go? Where do you hope to see the field of occupational therapy go? What do you think is up and coming in terms of trends and focus?
I'd love to see OT integrated into mental health settings more. Right now I'm in Arizona and there just are not opportunities. And a part of it is
Mhm,
payment. In a perfect world, we can solve that issue, which is a big issue systemically. But even just places bringing in OTs more, figuring out how to make it work. And so, being in the addiction world now, I am essentially like the only OT that is integrated into substance use right now that I know of. That doesn't mean that I am, but that I know of and have talked to different agencies and places. And I'd love to see us just as a typical
yeah.
provider to be able to help people, especially with that reintegration. Same with other like eating disorder, private practice, clinics, whatever it may be. We can be this key person to help alleviate the demands that other mental health professionals are facing for someone to be the trauma provider and the everyday task provider, and it's
It's a
just too
lot.
much. I think when we're all doing what we do really well, we have better
Oh,
client
wow.
outcomes. And so, I mean, a more realistic goal is more conversation around like, how do we make
Right,
it
right.
happen? Logistically, how can we make
Yeah.
this
Yeah,
happen?
no, it's so true, and that actually touches on my one of my passions, which is true integrative care. You hit the nail on the head there with saying it is too much for one person or a provider to handle all of those things, so to be able to work with and this is again why I love occupational therapy so much is that there's such a synergistic and an opportune moment for integration with client care that I don't understand why we're not already
Hmm.
doing this, so I love it. I love it. That's so great. So, how about yourself? What do you think are some emerging areas in occupational therapy that excite you the most about the future of the field?
Think working with the unhomed
Mhm.
population. I have a colleague at Midwestern where that is a passion area for her, and the work that she's doing. CAS is the largest organization down in Arizona, and her name is Dr. De La Montaigne, and she's doing some really incredible
Mm,
work and maternal health, maternal mental
yeah.
health. That's another area of passion, specifically with neurodivergent women or neurodivergent parents, first time parents. It's very hard. And so I love to see that more. I think our roots are in
Mhm.
mental health. We started in mental health, but it feels like we're now re-emerging into it. And even eating disorders, I definitely think is a more emerging, I shouldn't say emerging, we've been there. We're like redefining our
Mhm.
role in it, working with individuals like immigration, refugees, being able to provide services. Because when you come to a new country and everything's different, how do you engage in daily life as you used
Yeah.
to know it? A lot of OTs too, working, specializing more in working with LGBTQ plus
Mhm.
populations is also really key because that whole need for mental health is just so important. Again, like affirming care, being there for clients as they are. So
Yeah.
yeah,
No, I love that. That's so great. I would love to also know, how do you manage it for yourself in your own life?
constant evaluation all the time. I'm always having to, especially like being a mom and then your kids are babies for a while and then they get older and then life changes and it's not easy, but I think it's making a commitment to always reevaluating and changing things as needed. So actually, I have been with Midwestern University for about 7 years almost. March is 7 years. And I actually will continue to be a part of the team as a regular adjunct and teach the mental health
You
courses that I have stepped down as a full
Mhm.
faculty member. Where I am in my life, I can't give all that I need to as a full faculty member because there's a lot of other things. And I also have a lot of clinical areas of passion. And so my team is amazing and they've been so accepting of that. And so I still get to be a part of it, but that's been a big change for me recently. So it's always reevaluating and never having fear around having some of those hard conversations when you realize something isn't fitting into your life anymore. And I think as much as a mental health provider, we give space to our clients and tell them to reflect on what their body is communicating. We need to listen to that as well. And sometimes it's a change of
Mhm.
environment. Sometimes it's a job change. Being able to make those choices as they
Yeah.
surface.
I always love to advocate for providers, support. And one of the things that I'm passionate about is making sure that we are also here for each other. What do you think is most needed right now in terms of provider support and navigating the
Yeah.
challenges that we're facing in our current landscape of the clinical world?
I think compassion amongst each other. We all do things a little bit different, but I think at the end of the day, we deeply care about our clients equally. So recognizing that we all have different areas of strength and they may not look the same. And sometimes we might see things differently, but we have the same
Yeah.
end goal. And then I think also normalizing getting mental health support for
Yes.
ourselves too, which I think is pretty, it's becoming much more normalized, but really like understanding like we can't do it all and holding space and supporting people. We need someone to be there for us as
Mhm.
well. I think those are the two big things. And I also think reminding each other. I mean, most of my close friends are actually
Oh, nice.
psychologists. And what I love about our communication too is before we share something, like if we've had something hard happen in our life, one of my best girlfriends, Dr. Servin, she's a child psychologist. She'll always ask, do you have
Mhm.
space? I have something I need here, but do you have space for that? And I've now adopted that too because what a
Yeah.
great way to say, hey, I'm not just
Yeah.
gonna share this. I want to make sure
Yeah.
it's right a place. Uh, and then also holding each other accountable. Do you need support or like how can I support you or help you? I think opening the conversation for that. Sometimes we don't
Yeah.
recognize it when we're off or
Yeah.
need help.
Yeah. And I think providing can get very isolative if you allow it. That thought
Oh yeah.
process of, "No, I don't have time to be able to get help for myself," comes in more often than not because what are we doing? We're trying to navigate this and that and this and that and work and
Yes.
extra stuff and all of that. So I love that you said that because, again, I sing the same song, providers need support, and it's okay to ask for that help, and it's very important to have that sense of connection as well
Mhm.
for providers. So yeah, 100%. Wonderful. Okay, so we always land on the last question of our podcast, but before I do, I wanted to ask you, is there anything else that you wanted to share with the audience or reinforce?
No, I mean, you've asked so many great questions,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Mala. I think if
Yeah.
anything, it's just knowing that OT is always a potential
Yeah.
support, and that if everyday life just feels really
Mhm.
hard, OT might be a really great support system
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
you.
Absolutely. 100% agree. All right. So the last question that we always ask is, what does recovery mean to you?
Recovery is about holding space for yourself and having flexibility in terms of it's not a straight
Mhm.
trajectory. It's being able to be on this path and then veering off, but finding your way
Mhm.
back. It's about having compassion for yourself. It's about holding boundaries for yourself and with others. There's no
Yeah.
end point. It's this thing you're in and you're committed to, and having compassion if you deviate from it.
Mhm. Love it. Love it. Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah. Again, where can people find you and how can they reach you?
Yeah, so I have an Instagram, Elevated Wellbeing OT, and then my website's also www.elevatedwellbeingot.com, and you could always email me at hello@elevatedwellbeingot.com as well. So feel free to reach out even if it's just, having a question. If you live in another state and you want connection with another support provider, I know amazing mental health OTs all over the country. So I be happy to be a support system for anyone who is needing some questions
That's
answered.
wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Recovery.com podcast. For additional information, resources, and to access treatment options, please visit our website at Recovery.com. We appreciate your listenership and are excited to have you join us on our next show coming soon.